Hello, my name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and this is a lecture in my graduate course at Virginia Tech on the book A Biography of No Place by Kate Brown. This lecture I'm entitling Unmaking a Borderland. And what I want to do in this lecture is discuss this book. I like this book an awful lot. I want to discuss why I am using it in this lecture and why I think it's very, very useful in thinking about questions concerning political geography, concerning territory, space, identity, and violence. Now, Kate Brown is a professor of history, and she is currently at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. Now, her work is very geographical, even though she is a historian, and it is concerned with the ways in which states make space. States create territories, create territorial regimes. And by states, I really mean sort of power structures at the center, which are in the hands of a certain clique or a certain party or a certain power structure. And in this particular case, this is a power structure which sees itself as representing the modern. And it is dealing with an area that this power structure conceptualizes as backward. The relationship is, as she points out in the book, often explicitly a colonial one, in which the modern is the imperial center, it's the metropole, which is seeking in its own terms to improve, to better, to break backwardness, to overcome backwardness in this particular region. But as she points out in the book again and again, this comes at a very, very high cost. And indeed, in beginning the book by discussing Walter Benjamin in the Arcades, she's really talking about the ways in which we are looking at progress in part as being a story of destruction and a story of the wreckage that is created by the process of modernization and the process of state territorial control, the creation of security. So it's that wreckage of the 20th century that we're looking at. And in this particular case, we're looking at the ways in which localized places have spatialities, have particular regional identities, and that they're not fully in the grip of a state. And so part of the story of the development of the modern territorial nation state, that sort of complex, that triangle, is the story of the crushing of places into a more homogeneous conception of the state. So we need to grasp that there are different prevailing territorialities being promoted by states, imagined conceptions of the territory. There is, which is coming down from on high, or which is being imported, which is coming many instances through the barrel of a gun, through a tank, through coercion. And then that's meeting the place-based life world, where the understandings of that place and the actual everyday life in that place is really has a different rhythm to it, has a different understanding of space and time, and has a different set of relationships between peoples. So it's a story of recognizing local places, about territorialities, about state power, and fourthly about ruins. Now, in this particular case, she gives the book a very provocative title, A Biography of Nowhere. And it is a very interesting case study because it's a place where you have difficulty getting to grips with, because there's no sort of cultural center, there's no coherent place that endures, like Lviv, Lvov, and that, or Kiev, and the particular story of that. Instead, it's this particular region which is defined, and she uses a series of different terminologies, and I want to go through those particular terminologies with you. It's defined as a borderland, and it is, to a certain extent, it's a no place to the state itself, to the central authorities. It is an ambiguous place. It's a place which doesn't present a legible surface to the state for it to understand, and that's part of the story that she wants to tell. But for geographic purposes, we're really talking about the if you look on this particular map of contemporary Ukraine, and you kind of use the coordinates Lviv and Kiev, and Zhytomyr as to the west of Kiev, it's the area around Zhytomyr and Rivne and north there of that we're really talking about. You see Chernobyl up to the north of Kiev. So it's that particular region, all to Rivne and Lutsk. But she uses a series of different spatializations to try to define it. The first of these is the term Kresy. And the Kresy is a Polish term which is derived from German, and it refers to a border, the border areas. Now, you need to grasp, and she doesn't really bring this out clearly, in Polish it has a very specific meaning, or at least it has a set of associations. First of which is, it defines the area to the east of the Curzon line. So it is the lost territories of the Polish state. And now, in this Polish understanding, that does not necessarily include the territories in Ukraine that she wants to discuss. So that's one understanding of it. It's the sense of it's the Polish territories that were lost. But there is a second Polish understanding of it too, which is that it is a Polish ethnospace. And so therefore the term Kresy accents the Polishness of the territories as opposed to their multi-ethnicity and their multi-confessional character. So that's another thing to keep in mind. What she's doing is she's using the term in a kind of a broad way to define a region which is in modern day Ukraine, was on the border between interwar Poland and Soviet Ukraine. And she's particularly interested in the Ukrainian side of that. So her analysis is really of the Ukrainian, meaning the Soviet Ukrainian borderlands. Now, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that there is a large memory industry out there concerning the Polish diaspora and the Poles in this particular region. And this is one website that I wanted to draw your attention to. And I would suggest you kind of spend some time looking at this website because it's got a lot of really interesting things. Now, this is a particular foundation which is interested in recognizing the struggle of Polish citizens under occupation and in exile, connection with World War II, but even earlier. So it's got a whole set of politics associated with it. The historical galleries are really quite interesting. Begin with the kind of Polish borderlands. So I would recommend that you begin to look at that to just get some sense of the resources that are out there on that and the Polish understanding of Kresy. Now, the second spatialization that she uses again on and off in the book is right bank, left bank Ukraine. If you're not familiar with it, it's a bit confusing. The right bank is the area to the west of the Dnieper River. It's really between the Dnieper and the Dniester River. And it defines that particular area, and it refers to the 17th and 18th century more than anything else. So that's a second spatialization that she uses, and in part her book is on the part of the right bank of Ukraine. Now, a third spatialization that is used is Polesia. And Polesia is a term which refers to a natural region. It's a natural region of forest and marsh. And it is a region which is defined by the Pripyat marshes in southern Belarus, around Brest and Homel. Also, it includes northern Ukraine, so Rivne, Volyn, Zhytomyr, Kiev, and then also partly in Poland. It refers to Lubin and even part of Russia. So it is a broad region which she refers to on and off again. Now, who lived in the Kresy lands? Well, as you can see, that's part of what the state seeks to do. So in that wonderful chapter inventory, which is chapter 1, she chronicles the efforts by the Soviet state with their ethnographers and their geographers who go out into the particular territories or the lands. They're not really yet mastered as territories. The lands that they inherited after the establishment of the Soviet Union and the end of World War I and the end of the war with Poland. So there are Jews there of many different types. She pays particular attention to the Hasidim Jewish community, and in particular the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, Nachman of Bratslav, and she ends actually with the Nachman. And I've been to Ukraine, and it's really quite something to see the Nachman go back to Ukraine, and they go back every year in order to celebrate Nachman's birth and celebrate and party in that particular area. And so that's part of Ukraine to this day. And the Jewish population, of course, is an absolutely horrific and tragic history in this region. Well, they were a strong part of the population there. Then there were Germans. But again, I'm using inverted commas in all cases here because, as she points out, the identity of people was as locals. That's how they identified. And they had their own, there was a mosaic, a very particularized mosaic. There were Mennonite villages, there were Catholic villages, Lutheran villages, Baptists. There were Catholic Poles, Catholic Ukrainians. There were Poles that didn't speak Polish, and there were Poles that didn't recognize themselves as Poles. And it was, of course, a question as to whether they were Polish. And that's part of the story of the effort by the state to chronicle and to classify people who have a sense of their identity as belonging to here. I am a local. I am from this area. What language do you speak? I speak the language here. So that is partly a story of the ways in which places get reconfigured, and states and peoples. There's a biopolitics here as well as a geo-territorial politics. That's part of the story that she wants to tell. Now, the larger book is really about these kind of regimes of territorialization, and remembering that the term territory and terror are sometimes linked in terms of their genealogy. In this particular case, there is a terrorism, a state terror that goes along with the establishment of regimes of territorialization in these areas. So it's a pretty horrific story in many ways. What she does is she tells the biography of this region in terms of, first of all, it's controlled by the initial Ukraine that was established by the Soviet Union, and the Kerenzatsaya movement, which was the indigenization movement by the Bolsheviks in the 1920s to try to give Bolshevism local legitimacy. And how did they do that? By identifying with the national aspirations of various peoples and seeking to provide ethno-territories. So there's an attempt to create a Polish ethno-territory. And it's that kind of hunt for Marchlewsk. And then there's a German territory as well, which he spells less time on. That's part of the story that she tells here. This Polish territory, so-called Polish territory, existed for 10 years. She discusses its creation, and then it disappears. It's abolished, and it's abolished within the context of other things going on. In the 1920s, you have the new economic policy, which seeks to try to lead to greater productivity in the countryside. It fails in many instances. There's a famine. There's poor harvests. And then you have this massive change in 1928 when Stalin takes over. And you have this drive for the collectivization of agriculture. Probably one of the most singly disastrous and horrific acts in 20th century Europe, because it led to the deaths of millions and produced famine in Ukraine and in Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Russia as a consequence of this particular disastrous policies which were carried out until the 1940s. With that, you had when these policies, this kind of forced industrialization of the city, of certain regions, and the forced sort of collectivization of agriculture, those two things being connected, when those failed, then that was not seen as the failure of the particular policies, but seen as the work of saboteurs and of those that were resisting the march of history and of progress. And then you had purges and a series of deportations from the 1930 on to 1939 in Soviet Ukraine. Then, of course, you have the beginning of World War II. In 1939 with the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which moves Ukraine further west as they take over parts of Poland. So the border actually moves and the area doesn't become a border land. But then that only lasts until June 1941. And then you have the Operation Barbarossa, the invasion by the Wehrmacht of the Soviet Union. And the area coming under control of the Wehrmacht and the Nazi state from 1941 onwards. And so you have sort of two regimes. You have the early optimistic years, according to the Nazis, in 1941, and then you have the years of the 1942-43 when the Nazis were losing the war, and it was clear that they were going to have to retreat from that area. All of these kind of moments in the biography of this place are, of course, really terribly disturbing and wound not simply the place but millions of people. She tells this story by focusing on the careers of a series of different state bureaucrats, beginning with Jan Selevich, who is a commissioner of national minority affairs. He's the person that really wills the Polish ethno-territory into existence. Then you have the displacement of that particular project by collectivization, and then you have increasing securitization by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, and then you have the Germans moving in, and she focuses on the career of Professor Karl Stumpf in the area. So here is a map from the book which shows the Marchlewska Polish Autonomous Region that was created. And I wanted to read to you from page 42, this first chapter, in which he writes, "People make their territory by naming the things in it. For this reason, communist officials were repeatedly arriving in the villages, notebooks in hand, counting, recording, forming commissions and writing reports. And after they counted and mapped, they knew. They knew who a Pole was, just as they knew what made up the psychological and physical demeanor of a rich peasant, a kulak. Soviet officials assumed that nationality, like class, bore essential traits commonly held by all members of that nationality. Poles, they assumed, possessed similar national interests, loyalties and sentiments that could be especially dangerous, a security officer noted, because Poles lived in a quote-unquote compact mass in their own separate administrative entity." Well, Soviet officials had only just created this entity, yet it quickly acquired agency to shape official attitudes. There's a lot of themes that you will be familiar with from reading Foucault and his discussion of governmentality, the desire to make the territory legible and the like. Then there's a terrific chapter, Ghosts in the Bathhouse, where she talks about the ways in which the Soviet state, the early Soviet state, really did not have a good grip on the territory, and people were able to defy it, and they protested against what was happening to them. And then she has a very nice section where she writes on page 67 about apparitions. This is after discussing the miracles of 1922, 1923, 1924, and the parades of villagers. Then she writes, "Ghosts, miracles, occurrences that today cannot be explained, made up a major part of everyday life in the borderlands, and for a long time played a much greater role than Bolshevik-sponsored apparitions such as nationality and class. The divine and supernatural dictated people's behavior as much or more than the ruling Communist Party, which proved impotent to stop the processions. This makes sense, for the ideologists resided far off and the party was poorly staffed, while ghosts could surface just about anywhere in the Kresy." Now notice what she's doing there. She's also talking about the fact that the particular categories used by the Bolsheviks themselves were apparitions. They were abstractions. They were reifications. They were sort of taxonomies, naming systems. But of course they became very real because they had the power of the state associated with them. Now, I wanted to just alert you to the fact that some of the themes that she's developing here are themes which are developed elsewhere, most interestingly by James C. Scott, his book Seeing Like a State, where he discusses collectivization and the Bolshevik schemas. And here you have one of the photographs from his book, Legible Scientific Forests versus Illegible Natural Forests. Now, the Crécy is an area of swampiness and of forests, and so it was an area which was dangerous as far as the state was concerned, because it didn't look like something that they controlled. So, you have the move towards collectivization from 1928 onwards, which is an extraordinary effort, and you can see this the Kulak farmer being bowled over by the new sort of proletarianized peasantry and the tractors behind them. Now, Stalin's collectivization of agriculture led to a series of different disasters and culminated in a famine in the 30s in Ukraine. This particular map is a map of the population loss, population decline in Ukraine and in Russia during this time from 1929 to 1933, the height of the effort to collectivize agriculture. Now, you'll notice that Zhytomyr it has less relative population decline than other areas, and that is because collectivization was not particularly successful in this region than in other areas. I shouldn't say successful, I should say it didn't penetrate sufficiently deeply so that there was sufficient resources on the part of ordinary people to feed themselves when you had famine. But still, this was a time of terror and of extreme deprivation, as well as the beginnings of deportations of people from the border area. Now, those deportations begin when you have the category of ethnicity take on a life of its own. This is the Bolshevik apparition that then defines people who may not necessarily have been Polish as being Polish and may not necessarily have been German in the way as people in Germany were, but nevertheless were defined as such and therefore defined as potential enemies, as potential traitors, as people out of place, and as threats on the border that could be potential fifth colonists helping the enemies of the Soviet Union. And so you had the beginnings of deportations. Now, the story of these deportations, which start from 1930 onwards, are often overshadowed by the later deportation of enemy nations, especially during World War II in 1944, the Chechens and the Kalmyks and others. What is important to bear in mind is that these initial population movement, this was initially seen as part of modernity. It was seen as a mechanism of improvement. Now, there were multiple motivations for it. One was the security fear, but to the people themselves, the way that the Soviet state operated was to say that people were going to go to areas where the agriculture was better, where they were going to be able to have a better life and richer farms. And so it was presented as something which was progressive. Now, the previous, this sort of previous progressive deportations, if one can use that phrase, then of course gives way to the enemy deportations. And these deportations happen when the Soviet Union takes over the Kresy, the Polish Kresy, after the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact and the German invasion, some weeks later, the Soviet invasion of Poland. The book, she provides a really very interesting chapter on the deportation, the experience of deportation, the experience of establishing a new home in northern Kazakhstan. And of course the results of that are still with us to this day. The northern part of Kazakhstan is an area which has a mixed population. And interestingly, as she points out in the book, that particular population is one that identifies as Russian. Page 191, she writes, Poles, Germans, Tatars, and Chechens, amongst others in exile in Kazakhstan, started to identify themselves in the census as Russian. Their identities began gradually to fuse into Soviet identities as they assimilated into Russian Soviet culture. They began to speak Soviet Russian in the same intonations broadcast over the radios, which began appearing in the settlements in the 50s. Now, the larger point that she's making here is one in which those that are deported are cut off from their previous homelands and places. She writes, page 148, by the end of 1935, nearly 2/3 of all those deported to eastern Ukraine had returned to their homes. Others left their assigned places of exile in search of homes elsewhere. This wandering worked to divest people of their property. Families who had departed from the borderlands with a cow, a horse, furniture, and a few sacks of grain returned to their original villages a few months later with no possessions at all, their belongings sold to pay for the trip back home. Stripped of their property, deportees also became disentangled from identities which had been rooted in places and possessions. Once villagers were cut off from the powerfully articulated terrain which had contained myth, faith, and personal and communal histories, the need for impersonal or national histories and abstract national identities became far more visceral. So here she's talking about the ways in which national identity in part is constituted by a detachment of people from particular places. They become no longer locals from here. They become instead people that are identifying with a particular state and particular homeland. Now, the Nazi invasion of the Kresy area is, of course, a disaster for the population, particularly the Jewish population. And you have the Holocaust of bullets in this area, which leads to horrific war crimes. I would recommend Wendy Lower's book, Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine, which is centered on the experience of Zhytomyr. And I also want to draw your attention to the fact that part of this involved, of course, a fantasy of creating German territories here. You're going to create a Reich Deutsch community, which is going to be cleared. It's going to be built upon territories cleared off Slavs, and there's a particularly interesting example of the attempt to try to create a German world south of Zhytomyr, called Helgewald, and it is something that I would urge you to look at the website of it, because it's quite an interesting story, and it involves Himmler and his particular fantasies of creating this idealized German community. So Brown ends her book by talking about the importance of forgotten places, and really her whole oeuvre, the other books that she has written subsequent to this book, Putopia and Dispatches from Dystopia, have the theme of spatialities other than those of the state, or spatialities conjured by technologies in the case of plutonium. But she writes, page 237, 238, "My hope is that by writing histories of forgotten places and discarded lives, we can unpack simple notions of victim and persecutor, release political discourse from the hold of property, borders, and genealogies, and instead look more self-consciously at places, backward, forgotten, destroyed, which are the product not of one side or the other, but of a more universal disregard for contingency and difference." So that's a rejection of this particular urge to nationalize space, to remember territories which once belonged to us. It's a rejection of the lost territories myth, which is still so very powerful in the cultural life of Poland, Ukraine, and elsewhere. And it's an effort to try to steer us towards an understanding of the contingencies and the complexity and depth of places, places which are more than simply state territories. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this lecture and you found it useful, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.